Well, I'm afraid nothing is better today than when I first started to study the relationship between media and terrorists and terrorism. In fact, I think that the coverage in the media of terrorist events and terrorism in general has worsened. And that has to do with the changes in the media. There is much more competition, and it seems to be much more difficult for people who make decisions in the newsroom and above to restrain their coverage to a way that the media do not become megaphones of terrorists. But I think the financial interests of media organizations and the great competition, and in a way also the attractiveness of shocking news that the audiences want to see and hear, has led to a magnification of violence, of terrorist violence. And what we see, therefore, is that terrorism, I think, is even more overcovered than it was, whatever, 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. You have now not only the traditional media, but you have social media. And the traditional media very often takes a cue from social media. And the social media, I think, is overestimating the terrorist threat. While terrorism is a real problem, it is not an existential threat. But the media coverage seems to indicate that it is a very existential threat. And that, of course, provides also some more license to governments to overreact to terrorism. So I think, to answer your question shortly, is the media coverage has not improved, but rather has gotten worse than it was in the past. Well, I'm not sure that the definition is new, but I think the real problem is that in the West, violence committed by Muslims is labeled as terrorism, whereas the same violence that is for political purposes perpetrated against civilians or non-combatants, the same violence, when it is committed by white Westerners, is not labeled terrorism. It is basically, particularly in the United States, called a hate crime. That's a big difference in labeling it. And while hate crimes can be despicable, they are not seen as a threat as terrorism. And so this kind of double standard by labeling everything, and I'm not saying that just as my sense of feeling. You know, I know from research, when you look at the coverage of a violent act by a Caucasian Westerner and by a Muslim, whether in the West or anywhere else, the label is different. And it seems to me that also the religion plays a great role. You know, in the West, it is a common practice to say it's a jihadist, Islamist terrorism. You never read that it's Christian terrorism or Jewish terrorism. And I think that makes, creates a big divide. I said earlier, I don't know if you were there, I think I was very pleased after the Christchurch horrific shootings in 2 mosques in New Zealand, where the Prime Minister very quickly came out and said this is an act of terrorism. As bad as the thing was, that's the one good thing, that there was no hesitancy. And I don't know about you, but I mean, I saw, after the fact, I saw the video a couple hours later, and then I started to read the so-called manifesto. Nobody could have doubted that that was an act of terrorism. But in the normal world, if that happened in the United States or in the UK, there would not the leader of the country come right away out to say this is an act of terrorism. I think that was a big difference. I would hope that that sets a new standard. I'm afraid it will not. No. I think the states have not found a good counter-narrative to what the propaganda messages of terrorists are. I don't know exactly why that is, but it seems to me that the terrorism we have to do with today, both what I call, for lack of a better word, jihadist terrorism, and the right extremist terrorism, which we have seen in New Zealand, but we see it all over. That is another thing, it's underreported. In the United States, we have seen many more incidents and many more people killed since 9/11 by right extremists, whites, Christians, than by Muslims who adhered to the extremism of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. That's not evenly reported, but made as it is. If we want to counter both, these are transnational movements, both. It's not just right extremism is a little bit in Australia, it's in Europe a bit, in their connections, they are connected, as are, you know, the ISIS Al-Qaeda types of groups. They're different organizations, but it's a big movement. And it seems to me, if we want to find effective counter-narratives, then we also have to work transnationally. A conference like this is not really geared to, the theme of the conference is not how do we find a good counter narrative to the terrorist message. But I think countries all over the world have to get together and find a good common counter narrative. And I can't believe that we are so skillful in the United States, in Europe, in your part of the world, in the Middle East. You know, businesses, governments are so good in public relations. Call it propaganda. We have to be able to put together a good counter narrative. But I think it's a lack of cooperation between different countries and different parts of the world. If we would get together, I think we could counter that effectively.